Good morning. I want to tell you about Sanook. Sanook is a recent immigrant to this country, and she works at a restaurant that my husband and I often go to after working out on Sundays. She is a great waitress, but that's not the most important thing. She has a joy, a sparkle about her, and she has that unique joy that immigrants who really get what this country is about exude. I don't know the particulars of Sanook's immigration to the United States and why she left a familiar language, a familiar culture, halfway across the world. But we can know about another young immigrant who left the Soviet Union decades ago and who, at a gathering to say goodbye to her, was told by a young man in 1926, "When you get there, tell them that Russia is a huge cemetery and that we are all dying." Ayn Rand arrived in New York City on a cold winter night, and her first sight of the city was the lights of the skyscrapers shining through a mist of light snow. She became, as she put it, an American by choice, and she was an aspiring novelist. She waited a few years to start writing, but in 1930, at the age of 25, she decided to start a book. She felt she was, quote, too young to write about adults, unquote, and her knowledge of American culture was still somewhat lacking. So she chose to write a novel primarily about people her own age and have it set in her former homeland. Her philosophy wasn't fully formed, but she knew from experience that a certain kind of government will make it very difficult or even impossible to live. She was confronted with a question that we all ask at one point or another. What motivates those who enslave and brutalize others? Ayn Rand's passion for ideas and her life experience, living through the Russian Revolution and seeing what it did to her own life and the life of her family and her loved ones, and her passion for ideas made the relationship of the individual to the state a burning issue in her mind, and this became the theme of her novel. The novel is called We the Living, and the original title that she had for it was Airtight, in the sense of what life is like under dictatorship. In her journals, she wrote that dictatorship, quote, crushes a whole country and smothers every bit of life, action, and air. It makes the atmosphere choking, airtight, unquote. In 1930, when she began writing, Ayn Rand did not yet have the answer as to the why, but she could see two premises at work, one that drove the brutes and one that drove those who they abused, but who refused to be brutes but wanted to just live. Years later, she wrote, "In Atlas Shrugged, I show why men are motivated by a life premise or a death premise. In We the Living, I show only that they are." The plot occurred to her initially as a twist on the standard plot of a heroine, a virtuous girl, who sells herself to the villain in order to save the life of the hero who she loves. But she added the question, wouldn't it be interesting if, quote, the man to whom the girl sells herself is not a villain but a hero, and the man for whom she makes her sacrifice is the villain in the end? She finished We the Living in 1933, had a terrible time publishing it. It was finally published in 1936. This was the red decade. Nobody wanted to touch this book. We the Living quickly went out of print, and it was not republished in the United States until 1958. Given Ayn Rand's age and circumstances, one might find that this novel is an awkward, crudely constructed book. I don't find that at all. I'm going to read to you a few passages to illustrate. Early in the novel, Kira, the heroine, is departing from her second meeting with Leo, the man she loves. It is night, it's cold, and she's in an abandoned garden. He has just tenderly kissed the palm of her hand in farewell. Then he turned quickly and walked away. The snow creaked under his feet. The sound and the figure melted into the darkness, while she was still standing motionless, her hand outstretched, until a little white flake fluttered into her palm onto the unseen treasure she was afraid to spill. Later, a villain whispers, "On the internal front, there are no bombs, no machine guns. When our enemies fall, there is no blood, no cry. The world never knows when they were killed. Sometimes they don't know it themselves. This day, Comrade Sierov, belongs to the fighters of red culture. Later in the novel, when Leo is arrested, Kira confronts Andrei, the man she sold herself to in order to save Leo. Go through the garrets and basements where men live in your red cities and see how many cases like this you can find. He wanted to live. You think everything that breathes can live? You've learned differently, I know. But he was the one who could have lived. There aren't many of them, so they don't count with you. The doctor said he was going to die, and I loved him. You've learned what that means too, haven't you? He didn't need much, only rest and fresh air and food. He had no right to that, had he? Your state said so. We tried to beg. We begged humbly. Do you know what they said? There was a doctor in a hospital, and he said he had hundreds on his waiting list. Some have asked if the novel is autobiographical. Ayn Rand's answer? Quote, "We the Living is as near to an autobiography as I will ever write, not in the literal, but only in the intellectual sense. The specific events of Kira's life were not mine. Her ideas, her convictions, her values were and are." There are other sources of information on the life in the USSR. Recently, the powerful documentary, The Soviet Story. If you haven't seen it, you should. But to dig deeper into the root cause of the horror and misery that occurred, and to fully appreciate that individual rights and limited government are not frills, but requirements of life. It's a piece of romantic fiction, We the Living, that does that for me best. This book gives me added appreciation for my heritage and intensifies my delight when I encounter an immigrant like Sunuk, who has the joy of living in the relative fresh air of freedom, and who is an American by choice. Ayn Rand said that We the Living is not just a story about Soviet Russia in 1925. She wrote, "It is a story about dictatorship, anywhere, at any time, whether it be Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, or, which this novel might do its share to prevent, a socialist America." Thank you.